Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. My name is Jim, and this episode is going to cover the Oregon-Michigan game this weekend. And specifically, we want to cover the draftable players that we see playing in the game and kind of talk about where they are on the draft board right now. So let's start with Oregon. And I want to point out that at the top of the player board for Oregon is offensive tackle Josh Connerly. And then a couple spots below him is offensive tackle Ajani Cornelius. And I think Cornelius and Connerly are going to be two of the top tackles selected in the draft. So let's say two of the top 10, two of the top 15 will be where they are. And they're going to be going up against a really good Michigan defensive line. So Michigan's defensive line is probably going to have three players get drafted, and then they have a linebacker right behind him that's going to get drafted too. So it's a really good matchup when we see a college offensive lineman go up against a college defensive lineman where they're both going to get drafted. That's going to give us a really good gauge as to where each player should be. Let's say on a board, on the boards that we build. So want to definitely give a shout out to Josh Connerly and Ajani Cornelius in that regard. Jordan Birch is a defensive lineman, and I have him in my top 100. So smaller defensive lineman, but a very good defensive lineman. So probably a 3 tech at the NFL level. But let's take a look at Jordan Birch against the Michigan offensive line. And then Oregon has a couple of wide receivers that we want to talk about, and that's Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart. So Tez Johnson I have in the top 100. Evan Stewart I have outside the top 100. So what you should be asking yourself would be a couple of questions. So Tez Johnson is more of a smaller, shiftier, faster receiver. So if your favorite NFL team is looking for a slot receiver, Tez Johnson would be in that round 3, round 4 conversation of, can we pick up our slot our slot wide receiver, round 3, round 4. Evan Stewart is a more prototypical wide receiver, a little bit further down the board. And what we should be asking ourselves about Evan Stewart is, can he play himself into the top 100? Right? So that's what you're kind of looking for out of Evan Stewart. And then one player that's way too low on this list is defensive lineman Derek Harmon from Oregon. I think Harmon is going to go in the top 50. So I'm going to be moving Harmon way up my board relative to where he is listed on this player board. But again, is Harmon an edge? Is he a defensive lineman? He's definitely a really good football player. So definitely check out the Oregon defensive line against Michigan. And there is a quarterback, Dylan Gabriel from Oregon, who will likely be drafted. I would say he's a day 3 quarterback. So just pointing out some names there for you to get used to. And then let's flip over to Michigan. Okay, Will Johnson is the highest rated player on the board for Michigan. He is injured, so he will not be playing. I believe he is out the rest of the year. Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant are probably the 2 top defensive tackles in the draft. You might get some people talking about Dante Corleone or Deion Walker ahead of Grant. But Mason Graham is in the top 10 and Grant is in the top 15, for me at least. So definitely pay attention to those top 3 names for Michigan on defense. The next player, Colston Loveland, this is an interesting discussion because Loveland entered this season as the number 1 tight end. And at this point for me, Loveland's fallen down the board from the standpoint of some other guys have either equaled him or gone ahead of him, and he's just not getting the ball, right? Michigan's passing game is struggling. So it's tough for Loveland to put up numbers to justify being a round one tight end. So that's where I'm saying that Loveland probably isn't tight end one, because I could think of at least one tight end that should go in round one and one or two more in round two. And I wouldn't even take a round two pick on Loveland just based upon he's not seeing the ball enough. So something for you to think about there. From the next player on the list, Rod Moore, the safety for Michigan, I have Moore inside the top 100. And this is going to be a really good safety class. So I think really good would be one safety in the top 15, three safeties in the top 50, and that would be three additional safeties in the top 50. And then I would say maybe five more safeties in the top 100, right? So are we talking 9 safeties in the top 100, right? It may only be 7 in the top 100, but that's still significantly better than the last 2 or 3 safety classes. So Rod Moore, safety for Michigan, pay attention to him, and especially because there's 2 wide receivers on the other side that are probably going to be playing in the NFL. So Rod Moore is going to be matched up against NFL caliber wide receivers. Okay. Jayshon Barham is definitely making a play to be one of the top 5 linebackers in the class. So is he one of the top 5 linebackers or one of the top 10 linebackers? So when you're watching the game against the number 1 team in the country, ask yourself that. Is Barham proving that he is one of the top 5 linebackers in the country? Just ask yourself that while you see him play. Some other players that we should mention: Donovan Edwards, running back from Michigan, and Khalil Mullings, running back from Michigan. I think both running backs are closer to top 20 than they are top 10. That is my opinion. And then the edges for Michigan, Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore, will be going against Connerly and Cornelius, right? So love seeing a tackle edge matchup. So no matter which tackle is going against which edge, we're looking at NFL caliber competition. So look to see, is Oregon being pressured? And if they are, is it coming from Moore and Stewart on the edge, or is it coming from Graham and Grant down the middle? But Michigan's front 7 is outstanding. So that's, even though Michigan isn't ranked going into the game, Michigan's defense matches up with Oregon really well. And as we know, Michigan's problems at quarterback could likely be the downfall of the team. And let's close out the podcast there. So this podcast is called Mrs. R Relevant. This podcast channel has draft content every day. We'll talk about game matchups like we just did. We will talk about scouting reports. Last Friday we did wide receivers and corners, and that's going to continue this Friday at 7:15 p.m. Eastern time. So if you want to know more about that, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter at NFL Draft Fanatic. No I in Fanatic on Twitter. We will talk about how an interactive mock draft simulator works on other podcast episodes. We will talk about scouting reports. We will talk about player matchups. We will talk about team building. We will talk about the salary cap ramifications of drafting a rookie. Okay? There's going to be all sorts of content on the NFL Draft Fanatics YouTube channel And that content will be new every day. There will be a daily episode on the draft covering something from now until April. So we welcome fans liking, following, subscribing. If you have questions on players, please drop them into the YouTube chat or add them to the Twitter feed. On behalf of NFL Draft Fanatics, which is the only interactive mock draft simulator, my name is Jim. And remember, every day can be your draft day if you have the right attitude. Thank you very much.